Very good afternoon to one and all attending today's webinar on debt recovery options, civil and criminal. I hope you're all fine and are in good health. I am Parth Mishra and I welcome you all to this webinar. I will be moderating this session along with my colleague Rishabh Chandra. At the outset, when an economy is going through difficult times, the most important focus area for every business is prompt recovery. However, there are several challenges in recovery, both for the creditors as well as debtors. Today, whenever there is a default, lenders take recourse to both civil and criminal remedies. On the one hand, we have all come across borrowers who had no intent to default, but have defaulted for reasons beyond their control. Sometimes change in law or regulation or taxes have made business unviable, and default is for reasons beyond the borrower's control. Of course, in such scenario, they must sell off their assets to pay their debts. However, these are not cases where the defaulting borrowers deserve to be imprisoned for check bouncing or cheating or criminal breach of trust. Whereas, on the other hand, are people who siphon off funds disbursed, do not use loans for the sanctioned purpose, sell off security without the consent of lenders, and do not pay despite having the resources. It is in these cases when remedies available under criminal laws certainly need to be pursued against such borrowers. So today, we are going to discuss debt recovery, keeping all these perspectives in mind. And our panelists for today's discussion are Ms. Sandhya Iyer, Mr. Melvin Fernandez, Ms. Naina Agarwal, and Mr. Mahim Sharma, all from the Mumbai office of Vash Associates Advocates. So as to keep the format of this session a little more interesting for our attendees, we have designed it in a question and answer session format. So without much further ado, let us commence with our session. And my first question I would ask to Mr. Melvin and Ms. Naina. As courts and NCLTs have started holding hearings through video conferencing, can you please share your experience with us in regard to the hearings through video conferencing?
Good afternoon, Parth, and good afternoon to all the participants in today's webinar. Insofar as my hearing my hearing was before the High Court, and for me it was a very pleasant experience with attending this hearing on the webinar. And the learnings, the day prior to the hearing, what had happened is we got an email intimation from the Bombay High Court intimating us of the board position, also setting out the link and the password. However, at the time of the hearing, there was no requirement for us to log into the password and to put in the password so that we could hear the proceedings. The proceedings were live and we could participate in the proceedings. Matters were called out by the judicial officer, and as and when the matter got called out, we could. So as and when the matters got called out, we could. As and when the matters got called out, we could participate into the hearings. Insofar as the hearings are concerned, what learnings we could get is that the pleadings have to be precise and concise, because filing of pleadings is only by way of an email, and therefore our pleadings should be concise. Secondly, what I had learned from the hearing is a matter prior to my hearing. There was a case where the advocate wanted to pass on some dates and events, and he informed the judge that he had emailed the dates and events to the judge, but the judge did not receive the dates and events. As a result, one learning is that if you want to have something to be taken on record, it is done much prior in point of time, so that the judge has the respective documentation with him.
Naina, would you please take up the question? I think we're losing Melvin, sir. So it would be better if you take up the question.
Hello, Parth. Good evening, everyone. Recently, I got an opportunity to attend a hearing before NCLT through video conferencing. It was an amazing experience, as I got to appear before the court after a quite long time. As for the procedure which is followed by NCLT, registrar creates a WhatsApp group for all the matters which are listed on that day, case-wise, including which consists of the advocates who are appearing in the particular matter. The registrar then, just before the matter about to be called out, would share the link and password so that you can join the session and attend the hearing. In my case also, the same procedure took place. For the applicant, the registrar always usually have the contact details, as he can take the same route from the application itself. But for the respondents, however, he does not have the contact details of the respondent as well as his advocates. And in that case, it is also advisable that the respondent advocates inform the advocate for the applicant, whoever is representing the applicant, and provide your contact details to the advocate of the applicant so that he can share the same with the registrar, and you can be added on the WhatsApp group, and you can have the access to the link and the password which is shared by the registrar. In my case also, as I was appearing for the respondent, I had to contact to the advocate for the applicant and had to get myself added to the WhatsApp group. As the registrar was immediately not taking the action, and the session was just about to start and the hearing was about to take place, I had to contact registrar multiple times to get myself added to the WhatsApp. Secondly, we are quite habitual of looking at the displays board and ascertain as to when our matter would reach. In the virtual hearings, they have by now not started the display board system. So in that case, one could not figure out when your matter would essentially reach. In the cases of NCLT, it is like when your link and the password is shared, you get to know, yeah, your matter is about to be get pulled out, and you should log in and attend the hearing. But the thing is, people are not sure. They have to be nearby their phone all the time to ascertain whenever the phone is beeping, is it from the registrar, so that he can log in and attend the hearing. So according to me, I think some steps should be taken to smoothen the process for attending the hearing. And one of our colleagues in the office had to wait till 6 p.m. Then he got the credentials and he could enter and attend the hearings. So as we now have to become habitual on living in the COVID-19 pandemic time, the process of virtual hearing should be smoothened and should be become more easier so that hearings can take place.
Thank you so much, Tana, for the valuable insight. Now, I would put my next question to Ms. Sandhya Iyer. If somebody has defaulted in payment of money, ma'am, what are all the options available against that defaulting person?
Parth, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So Parth, when a person defaults, and if I were the lender, I would look at the following options. So one option is always filing a regular suit in the court. But as we all know, a regular suit takes many, many years to dispose of. But all the same, it's one of the primary options that one has. When you are filing a regular suit, one thing that you should always remember is you must check out the court fees in the jurisdiction where you are wanting to file the proceedings. Like for example, in Maharashtra, the court fees are an ad valorem court fees which are capped at 3 lakh rupees. So it is not too high. But there was another state where the court fees were 0.5% ad valorem. So what happened is a client of ours wanted to file a mortgage suit for 10 crore. And the minute we told him that the fees work out to 50 lakhs, he was very hesitant because he didn't know how many years the mortgage suit would take to get decreed, whether by then the property would be there, it would have lost its value or not. So he was not willing to pay the 50 lakh court fees, and he said, okay, fine, I don't want this. And ultimately he went under IBC. So yes, regular suit option is available, but it can tend to be very long drawn, and you have to check the court fees that is applicable to see if it is feasible. Now, one more option that is available is the commercial code. You can file a suit under the Commercial Courts Act 2015. And here the amount involved in the dispute should be beyond the monetary threshold, and the dispute must pertain to a commercial dispute which is well defined in the Act. And Naina will explain in detail the proceedings under Commercial Courts Act. The third option that I'm going to speak about is summary suits. Now, summary suits can be filed in all high courts and other notified courts, but it can be filed only on limited documents and instruments. So one of the instruments on which it can be filed, you can file it on bills of exchange, hundis, promissory notes, or if you are seeking to recover a debt or a liquidated demand in money which is payable under a written contract, then you can file a summary suit. So we must understand that the nature of these instruments are basically ones where you don't have to lead lengthy evidence and the procedure is simple. Now, I will not get into the legal technicalities of how the summary suit progresses, but what I will say is the feature of a summary suit is that the borrower does not get the automatic right to defend, but he has to obtain leave from the court to defend. And this is the feature that is differentiating a summary suit from a regular suit. So what happens in these cases when leave is sought to defend from the court by the defendant? So one of the following options is possible. The court finds that, okay, this is a case where the borrower clearly has to pay money to the lender, in which case the court will reject the leave to defend and the plaintiff is immediately entitled to a judgment. This is a very, very easy process for the plaintiff, but rarely does it happen. Second option before the court is the court finds that the borrower has a good case on merits. There are lots of disputes and detailed evidence to be led. So this is not a case which can be decided summarily, and so the court decides to give unconditional leave to defend. When the defendant gets unconditional to leave to defend, then what happens is the case becomes like a regular suit, and again it takes several years to get resolved. The third and the most common feature or most common decision in a summary suit is the court will grant conditional leave to defend. In conditional leave to defend, the borrower has to deposit some money in court for the right to defend. And it is at this stage that the borrowers come forward to settle the matter. So as I said, summary suits can be filed only in notified courts. And my experience has been that summary suits have been quite effective in Mumbai. And I do recall one very complex matter which got decided in 3 years. And that too, before the decision of a single judge of the Bombay High Court, a division bench of the Bombay High Court and Supreme Court. All these three things happened within a year in a complex matter. So if you're lucky, it could get resolved pretty quickly. Now, the fourth option is if you have a contract under which you are required to recover money, then you must check whether you have an arbitration clause. So if you have an arbitration clause, you only can file arbitration proceedings and you cannot file a suit. And one important thing in these arbitration proceedings is, see, normally the detailed procedure for arbitration will be set out in the arbitration clause in your agreement. So for example, if your arbitration clause says that before taking recourse to arbitration, the senior management of the two parties must sit together and try to resolve the matter, then you must follow that procedure. So the procedure set out in your contract must be strictly followed. Otherwise, there could be technical objections by one or the other party, which could end in delaying matters. The fourth option that we've had till now is the IBC. And of course, now IBC, we are expecting an ordinance where applications will be prohibited for a period of 1 year. But we will cover it all the same because 1 year down the line, you will be able to file IBC proceedings. So explained very simply, if there is a defaulter, which is a company or a limited liability partnership, then under IBC, there is a resolution attempted. There's a whole process under which, you file an application and thereafter attempt a resolution, which is resolved in maybe 180, 270 or 330 days. And if that does not work out, the company goes into liquidation. Now, IBC, as per the spirit of the code, it is not supposed to be used as a recovery mechanism. But the fact is, every creditor uses this as a recovery mechanism only. So explained in simple terms, if you're a financial creditor, that is somebody who has lent money on interest terms, that interest has to be paid, then you can file proceedings under Section 7 of the IBC. If you have provided goods or services to somebody and the recipient or buyer is not paying you, then also you can file proceedings under Section 9 of the IBC, providing that there are no disputes between the parties. And now applications can also be filed against individual guarantors to corporate debtors. So this section, I think, relating to corporate guarantors, maybe you can take some more clarification from Naina when you speak to her. And
Yes,
the sixth option is the Section 138 to 142 of the Negotiable Instruments Act. So suppose you have given a loan which is very common, which is repayable in installments or a bullet payment. Quite often you take post-dated checks from the borrower and you bank it on the due date. If it bounces, you file this Section 138 complaint. So I will not get into this in detail because I think Mahim practices in this area and you will be posing questions to him on this. But I would only like to make one observation here, that if a borrower has defaulted due to circumstances beyond their control and is genuinely trying to make efforts to repay, there is no point in sending him to jail under 138 or any criminal proceedings. Sending a borrower to jail has never resulted in recovery of money for lenders. You are more likely to recover the money if he stays out of jail and runs his business. However, if you have a willful defaulter, in these cases, you must pursue criminal remedies to send across the message to that borrower and other borrowers that you view willful default and fraud very strictly and will not tolerate any borrower messing around on these aspects with you. Now, there are two more recovery mechanisms which are available only to banks and financial institutions, and I will cover it very, very quickly. So if banks or financial institutions have dues of more than 10 lakhs from a borrower, then these banks can file proceedings under Recovery of Debt and Bankruptcy Act in the debt recovery tribunals. But only banks and financial institutions can file proceedings in debt recovery tribunal. Then finally, the last one is the SARFAESI. So if banks or NBFCs with assets more than 100 crores or notified housing finance companies have taken security, then they can enforce it under Securitization and Reconstruction of Financial Assets and Enforcement of Security Interest Act, which is commonly known as SARFAESI. So here, what is the procedure? Once there is a default and the account is classified as non-performing asset, you give a notice of 60 days to the security provider. Now, if the security provider makes a representation after receiving the notice to the bank, then the bank has to consider the representation and communicate why it is rejecting the representation. And the bank has to do this within 15 days of receipt of the representation. If the security provider fails to discharge his liability in 60 days, that is the 60-day notice period that you have given, then the security creditor has drastic powers like enforcing the security, changing the management, appointing a management, etc. Now, the Supreme Court has held that possessing such drastic powers calls for a very high degree of faith, good faith, and fair play. Thus, if you are enforcing under the SARFAESI, or a bank or a financial institution enforcing under the SARFAESI, please remember that you must strictly follow the rules that are laid down under the SARFAESI rules. Because if you do not do so, there is a possibility that the DRT or DRAT may set it aside. So there is one more aspect in SARFAESI. The minute the 60-day notice is received by the borrower under SARFAESI, it sort of operates like an injunction. The borrower cannot transfer whatever security that they have created in favor of the lender. Now, these are the methods, but I would like to mention something very, very important in India, especially in view of the fact that court proceedings take a very, very long time. So, in the meanwhile, to protect your security, it is very important that you must get interim orders. Let me give you an example. Suppose there is a mortgage suit. In a mortgage suit, like I cannot wait for 10 years. In 10 years, the borrower might dispose of the mortgage property or the assets. So what you do is, you may be required to get an order of injunction restraining the debtor from dealing with or disposing of the property, or a status quo order, or sometimes even a receiver appointed. So what do? Immediately after filing the suit, you will file an interim application for whatever interim reliefs that you want. So on the first day when the defendant appears, the defendant will seek time to reply saying that this lender has filed such an extensive plaint and I have to reply to these interim reliefs application. And they will in all possibility get time as well. So in the meanwhile, you should seek what is called ad interim reliefs. So that will operate as long as your interim application is not disposed of. And in most cases where there is a lender-borrower relationship, the courts are inclined to grant ad interim and interim reliefs. After that, what happens is the borrower will file a detailed reply to your application for interim reliefs. It gets heard and the final interim relief, if you're entitled to it, will get passed. And if you get any interim order in your favor, then that will last throughout the process till the final disposal of the suit. So generally in the case of lending transactions, you are able to get ad interim reliefs within maybe a couple of weeks or so. And interim reliefs, you should get it within 6 to 12 months. And these interim reliefs, as I said, continue during the pendency of the suit. So it is always observed that obtaining ad interim and interim reliefs plays a very important role in our system. And if you get a good order, it is possible, it is half the battle won, and it is possible. Sometimes the defendant will come to settle with you once the interim order is obtained. So generally, you will find a lot of people spending a lot of time and resources on trying to get good interim orders. However, in order to decide what kind of interim reliefs you require, you need to study your client and figure out which interim order will hurt them the most. Like, for example, in the case of chronic and willful defaulters, interim reliefs may not really work. So with this, I think I've summed up everything that I have to say on this different modes of recovery.
Very well explained, ma'am. So I would move on to the next question. So since the stamp duty is high in Maharashtra, many parties execute documents in other states. So what are the checks and balances required from an enforcement perspective?
Yeah, so let me give you an example. As we all know, Maharashtra is a state in which stamp duty is extremely high. And it is the normal practice. And I think the most popular place is Delhi, because I think Delhi is one of the places where the stamp duty is the lowest. So in Maharashtra, there is the tendency that wherever documents are to be executed, like we've had, let's take a case of a client, their entire operations are in Maharashtra. Their office is in Maharashtra, but they choose to, I mean, maybe they have a small office in Delhi and they choose to execute the documents in Delhi. So what are the problems that could crop up? Now, before I start on this, I would like to explain one thing. As far as immovable property is concerned, any transaction in immovable property involving right title interest has to be registered in the state where the property is located. So we generally see that when it comes to immovable property, parties normally execute in the state of execution. So it's an other kind of documents and transactions that you tend to go outside the state. So what are the problems? Now, let me take a lending document. Suppose you've given a loan and you say, okay, loan agreement stamp duty is very high in Maharashtra. Let me go to Delhi and execute it. One of your securities is hypothecation. Now, if your borrower is a company, the one who has created a charge is a company, you have to make ROC filings from Delhi. So what happens is, in the course of ROC filings, a soft copy of the document is brought into Maharashtra. So Maharashtra law is very clear. Either you bring the original into Maharashtra, get a soft copy into Maharashtra, or you get a photocopy, it will attract the differential stamp duty. So that is the risk. So if your registered office is in Maharashtra and deed of hypothecation you execute in Delhi, if you're filing your ROC filings, immediately when you file, stamp duty gets attracted. One more thing is, in certain states, we have found ROCs refusing to register till the differential stamp duty is paid. Sometimes you will have to bring in your documents into Maharashtra for audit purpose. Now, one experience that we have found in litigation is, sometimes, the borrower keeps track that, okay, these people have brought this document earlier and have not paid stamp duty, and they create problems at the time of enforcement, saying that, okay, 5 years back, they had brought this document in, but within 3 months, as is required by law, they did not pay the differential stamp duty. So do not admit this as evidence and let it get adjudicated. So yes, you may adjudicate, pay the stamp duty, but remember that this delays your proceedings. And I think that one of the biggest difficulty in doing executing documents outside the state is that, like, for example, suppose now everything is located in Maharashtra for me. I cannot bring any copy this one original document into Maharashtra because it will attract larger stamp duty. So what I have to do is, the dispute resolution clause and arbitration clause, jurisdiction of courts also have to be Delhi. And so what happens is, tomorrow in the event of default, see, I am out of my home ground and I have to go to another place and litigate. So that sometimes, and your officers will have to go there every time. The person who knows the matters is in Maharashtra, he has to keep traveling. So there are all these administrative inconveniences. So as far as I am concerned, I would execute outside the state only for highly rated clients where I think there is a reasonable certainty that there will not be a default. For stressed accounts, I will always insist on execution of documents within the state. I hope it clarifies.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I would request Nana and put a few questions to our other panelists. So Nana, the next question is to you. Commercial Code was implemented in 2016, and thereafter Commercial Court and Commercial Division have been constituted at district level and high courts respectively. So whether the Commercial Courts and Commercial Division constituted would assist in speedy disposal.
Yes, Pat, according to me, Commercial Court Act would have an impact and would assist in speedy disposal of the cases. Commercial disputes as defined in the Commercial Court Act broadly includes disputes relating to transactions between merchants, bankers, financials, traders, etc., and pertains to the dispute in relation to the shareholder agreements, mercantile documents, partnership agreement, joint venture agreements, intellectual property rights, etc., having a specified value of more than 3 lakhs, which can be tried and adjudicated before the commercial courts and commercial divisions of the High Court. Even the appeal in respect of such cases lie before the commercial divisions only. Designating such as specialized courts and divisions, according to me, would enable expeditious adjudication. And as far as we see the records, as of now, there are like many cases which have been initiated in 2016 and 2017 have reached at the stage of trial. Even couple of matters which I am handling of 2016-2017 of commercial courts pertaining to commercial division, cross-examination of one of the parties have started and has reached at the stage of conclusion also. There are other features of the Commercial Courts Act also, as well, which would assist in speedy disposal of the cases. The one such feature is strict timelines. When they used to file the normal suit, there was hardly any case when defendant would file the written statement within the time span of 120 days. In the Commercial Court Act, it is mandatory for the defendant to file a written statement within 120 days, after which it would not get the chance to file the written statement, even if he has a good defense. Second, like a written statement, there are other timelines. There are other timelines also provided in the Commercial Court Act which are required to be strictly followed. Further, one of the important features of the Commercial Court Act is the pre-institution mediation, which has to be mandatorily followed by the parties who wants to initiate a commercial suit, until unless they want to seek some urgent or identity reliefs. According to me, if the parties will have to mandatorily go to for the pre-institution mediation, then there would be chances that the matters would not reach to the court and would get settled at that stage itself. The orders which will be passed, the settlement orders will be passed by the legal service authorities who would undertake such mediation will be enforceable as that of the arbitral order, in the same manner as that of the arbitral award. Further, to assist and to accommodate the strict timelines and other provisions of the Commercial Code, the provisions of CPC has also been amended. Now, any person who is instituting a suit has to be very careful in seeking relief, as he has to substantiate its claim with a substantial proof. In the case the plaintiff fails to substantiate its claim with sufficient proof, then there might be cases that he would be subject to imposition of cost, as the definition of the cost provided in the CPC has been amended drastically. Secondly, this Commercial Court Act also provides for the summary judgment. If after the filing of written statement, the defendant is of the plaintiff of the view that the defendant does not have good case on merits, then he can file an application for seeking a summary judgment. And if the court comes to the conclusion, yes, the defendant does not have a good case on merit and the matter can be disposed of without oral evidence, then the court would pass the summary judgment. Further, under the Commercial Code Act, the provision of the CPC has been amended so as to provide that no revision or appeal would lie from any of the interlocutory application. Earlier, for each and every interlocutory orders that were passed by the courts, the parties used to prefer the appeal to the High Court and division bench of the High Court and Supreme Court, and that would result in pendency of the cases. So, according to me, all these are some of the features which I have highlighted. There are other features also of the Commercial Codes Act, and I hope that the Commercial Code Act would definitely help in speedy disposal of the case.
Thank you, Nana. Nana, my next question is that since you also practice IBC, so can you tell us about this new requirement about filing of default along with applications under Section 7 and how this thing would work?
Part NCLT has filed order dated 12th May 2020 has directed to file default record from the information utility along with the new petitions that are being filed under Section 7 of IBC. Even in the cases which are pending for adjudication, the parties are required to file default record from information utility before the next date of hearing. Though this order would not come into effect for the fresh filing as of here, for the period of, especially for the period of 1 year, as the initiation of fresh insolvency proceedings has been suspended for 1 year, as been announced by our finance minister yesterday. However, there is no clarity as to whether whether which the cases which are pending adjudication would be suspended or not. If the pending proceedings under Section 7 of the IBC would not be suspended, then financial creditors will have to file record of default with NCLT. Now the question comes: what exactly is record of default? It is, as we are aware, the information utility has been constituted as per the provisions of the IBC. The information utility is repository of the electronic evidence of the financial record, such as borrowing, securities which are created by the borrowers, defaults, etc. So, as whenever the lender will be lending the money to the debtors or to the borrowers, the lenders would inform the details of the same with the information utility, who would then maintain the record in respect of that borrower. The lenders will give each and every detail about the amount of money lended, the securities created, and the installments which are required to be paid by the borrowers. Whenever the borrower commits default, the lenders would have to again inform the information utility about the defaults created by the borrowers. The information utilities then would verify and authenticate the information which has been submitted by the lenders with respect to the default and seek the confirmation of the same from the borrowers or debtors. In case the borrower confirms that yes, there is a default in respect of this particular loan, then the information utility would mark it as would mark it or give the status as authenticated. In the case the borrower, despite of reminders which are being sent by the information utility, does not reply, then it would be presumed that these are deemed to have been authenticated by the borrowers or the debtors. In this case, the borrowers also have one right to dispute the amount of default or the interest rate sought or any other disputes which the borrower can raise with the information utility, which information utility would then confirm with the lender and give the status as disputed. This record, which is maintained by the information utility, will have to be retrieved by the financial creditors and would have to submit the same to the NCLT along with their petition. This is one of the steps towards enabling the NCLTs to meet the timelines as provided under the code. This can be seen from the fact that when the record will be marked as authenticated, it would mean the amount, the default has been confirmed by the debtor or the borrower, and there is no need for the detailed arguments. Same is the case with where the deemed to be authenticated. However, wherever the dispute would be raised by the borrower and debtor, in those cases only lengthy arguments would be required. Otherwise, no lengthy arguments will be required, and the application and the orders can be passed in those petitions, and the matter can.
Thank you so much, Naina, for explaining it. Now, since we are aware that the provisions relating to insolvency resolution and bankruptcy with regard to personal guarantors to corporate debtor, which is dealt in Part 3 of IBC, was notified recently. So can you share your personal experiences in filing applications under IBC against such personal guarantors?
As per the statement made by our finance minister yesterday, initiation of all insolvency proceedings have been suspended for 1 year. Earlier, as per the news articles, the information was with respect to suspension of Section 7 and Section 9 also. However, from this statement, it is not clear whether the initiation of IBC proceedings against the personal guarantors have also been suspended or not. In any event, the IBC proceedings against the personal guarantors at present are at the initial stage only. However, there are teething problems which one could foresee. One such reason, people, the creditors, even the registry and the judges tend to confuse the applications against the personal guarantors with that of the operational creditors and the operational debtors. They presume the matter is against the debtor only, and the same would be dealt as per Section 9. However, the proceedings against the personal guarantors are way bit different. For example, I'll try to explain it with an example. In the case of corporate debtors, the applicant, especially with respect to the operational creditors, one has to prove that yes, the person has defaulted in making payments in respect of the goods delivered or the services provided, and basis on that only, if the operational creditor has a claim over 1 lakh in respect of the same, then only the petition would be admitted, and then RP would be appointed and interim moratorium would take into place. However, in the case of personal guarantor, the scenario is different. There is no categorization of the financial creditor and the operational creditor at one place. There are only creditors who can initiate the proceedings against the personal guarantors. In the case of the personal guarantors, it is usually the financial creditors who can initiate the proceedings. Thereafter, in this case, when the application is filed, the interim moratorium starts from the date of filing of the application itself. Secondly, at the first hearing, the NCLT has to direct the IPPI to confirm the appointment of the resolution professional. The resolution professional then will submit the report as to the admission and rejection of the application against the personal guarantor. And basis the report submitted by the resolution professional, adjudicating authority or NCLT would pass the order accepting or rejecting the application. However, the NCLT benches, in most of the cases, even in the couple of the cases which even I have filed against the personal guarantors, have directed the personal guarantors to file the reply to the application or the petition filed against them, rather than appointing the resolution professional at the first place. Another problem one could foresee is a public announcement in respect of the personal guarantors has to be made by the registry of the NCLT. However, it is not clear as to how the registry would issue the public notices and where they will be issuing the public notices, and secondly, who actually will bear the cost for the public notice. So these are some of the problems which are being faced in the case of personal guarantors. However, the provision have just been implemented, so there the clarity might come as and when the matters are being proceeded.
All right, Nana. So Nana, for the benefit of all the attendees, can you mention some pitfalls to be avoided or precautions to be taken to avoid delay in adjudication and rejection of petitions filed before NCLT under Section 7 and Section 9 of IBC?
Yes, there are some common mistakes which parties make while filing Section 7 and Section 9 petitions before NCLT. One of the mistakes which are commonly being made is the authorization of the authorized representative to present the petition before NCLT. We have seen in many cases that the authorized representative of the financial creditor or the operational creditor is not sufficiently authorized to prefer a petition before the NCLT. Hence, this is one of the grounds which tends to delay the proceedings, or in some cases leads to rejection of such proceedings. Another aspect, another common mistake, another mistake that is being faced is like documents which are being annexed to the petitions, especially in case of the financial creditors, are not registered properly, or stamp duty is yet to be paid. So these are the common defenses which the respondents or the corporate debtors take, which tend to delay the matters. Thirdly, the statement of accounts which are being presented with the petitions are a bit complex. So it becomes difficult to make the NCLT bench understand the statement of accounts. In some of the cases, the working computation which is filed in the state and the statement of accounts which are filed do not tally with each other. And the same then again for the changes and for filing the fresh statement of accounts or working computation, the matter gets delayed. Another important aspect, especially in the case of financial creditors, which leads to delay the matter, is the OTS proposal. There are times when OTS proposal is being given. However, there is no formal rejection of the OTS proposal by the financial creditors. So the corporate debtor usually come and say that the OTS proposal is pending before the financial creditor, hence the matter should be adjourned. It is in these cases it is always advisable that a written rejection of the OTS proposal should be given. With respect to the Section 9 and operational creditors cases, we usually see that they do not maintain the records properly, especially the delivery challans or delivery of invoices. Sufficient acknowledgement is missing, which makes it difficult to prove that goods were actually supplied and invoices were actually delivered. Hence, for the operational creditors, from day one, it is advisable that they maintain their records properly. Secondly, the notices under Section 8, which are to be issued to the corporate debtors before initiating proceedings under Section 9, we usually see that these notices are usually issued by them itself, and they do not approach the advocates for the same. And in that, they tend to make mistakes as to they either do not provide all the sufficient proofs that are required to be provided with the notices, or in those cases they sometimes misses the details of some invoices, or there are times when calculation is not proper and the interest amount is missing. In all these cases, when they approach the advocate for the preferring Section 9, we have to advise them to again issue a notice under Section 8 in order to avoid any complexity in the matter. Yes, these are some of the pitfalls which are there and which can be avoided in order to avoid delay and rejection of Section 7 and Section 9 petitions.
Thank you so much, Nana. Now I would request my colleague Rishabh to take over from here. Rishabh, over to you.
Thank you, Parth. Before I commence, I would just request you to confirm if my network is sound.
Hello.
Thanks, Parth. Could you just confirm if my audio and video is sound so that I could commence further?
Yes, Rishabh, it is okay.
Thank you so much. A very good afternoon to all our attendees for today's session. To take the discussion forward, let us now come to Mr. Melvin Fernandez for the next round of questions and discussion. So Melvin sir, my first question to you is, today quite often we see that there is a common grievance of parties to a dispute that pursuing arbitration is very expensive, particularly if we talk about the small value arbitrations, where say for example the amount is less than 1 crore. Could you please share a few vital tips on how does one reduce the arbitration cost? Over to you, Melvin sir.
Yeah. Costs play a very important role for an organization, more so in case when the organization is faced with an arbitration proceedings, where the arbitration proceedings is for a value of less than 1 crore. Now, when we look at cost, there are certain costs which can be minimized. I can't say can't take it away completely, but you can minimize the cost. And there are certain costs which will have to be borne by the party. Now, what are the costs which will have to be borne? Cost such as the arbitrator's fees will have to be borne, whether you do this arbitration by way of an ad hoc arbitration or you do this arbitration through an institutional arbitration. Arbitrator's fees today, as per the Arbitration Conciliation Act, there is a schedule. The fourth schedule provides for the cost of an arbitrator's fee. So this cost is an unavoidable cost. The second cost which we can look at and try to minimize it is an administrative cost. Now again, if the administrative cost or if your arbitration proceedings is done through an institutional arbitration mechanism, then the institution who runs the arbitration, they have a schedule of fees. So at least to that extent, the organization knows as to what will be the administrative cost. But take for instance, if you're doing an ad hoc arbitration, there are ways and means where one can reduce one's administrative cost. For example, now in these days, everybody is getting their hands familiar with video conferencing. So one way of reducing the administrative cost is, instead of the old adage of having a venue booked, etc., and having a venue charges, one can look at having initial hearings and hearings on final applications, etc., through a video conference. One can also look at even going to the entire hog of arbitration, as the entire gamut of the arbitration proceedings, including cross-examination to video conferencing. But here there are certain reservations as to the cross-examination, etc. So here parties can take a call and can decide as to whether they would want to conduct the entire arbitration proceedings through video conferencing or just conduct part of it to video conferencing and have the cross-examination, etc., through a physical venue charges. Besides this, one can also look at other means to reduce costs, such as have e-filings done. In this day and age, when we try to move interim application before the courts, we have to be concise and precise in the filings. So let's try to adopt an e-filing mechanism. Not only we save on printing costs and cost of photocopies, etc., etc., and by e-filing, a lot of costs will be saved in that extent. Besides e-filing, one can also look at trying to reduce cost by trying to have only a documentation only arbitration. Very rare and very seldom do we see documentation only arbitration. How does this happen? In one of my arbitrations, that was an arbitration against a PSU, we had seen the case files and I'd studied the case files. The issue in consideration was well documented to various email exchanges between the parties. So at the preliminary hearing itself, I told the arbitrators, let's have a documentation only arbitration, because I don't foresee myself leading evidence since everything is on the email exchange between the parties. Luckily, the PSU agreed to a documentation arbitration. This arbitration was completed in 5 hearings. Out of 5 hearings, 3 hearings were for the final arguments and just 2 hearings just for parties to ensure that the pleadings are completed. So document only arbitration can be a way forward, provided that the issues are such, or the claims or the claims which parties have put forward are such that you do not require to need evidence. What could be such claims? For example, very simple claims such as there is no dispute on the supply, but there is no payment being made. So when there is no dispute regarding the quality, quantity, there's no demur on any of the aspects, but simply a party refuses to make a supply and there is an arbitration clause, parties can choose, or at least the claimant can make an attempt to do a document only arbitration, because everything is in place. You have the invoices, you have the contract, you have the invoices, and you have the amount of payment which has come and the amount of payment which hasn't come. So it becomes easy in such cases to do a document only arbitration. The works contract can be looked at. Payment of license fees, in case there's a dispute on the license fees to be paid, we can look at considering on the case by case basis whether a document only arbitration will work or a document only arbitration will not work. The other points can be that when we are drafting an arbitration clause, let's try to draft an ADR mechanism in the dispute resolution clause or in the arbitration clause, thereby ensuring that only a single issue is resolved through arbitration, and most of the issues get resolved through the ADR mechanism which follow the arbitration. Besides this, a little controversial is, like, you have the exchanges in BSE and NSE, they request parties which are in dispute, especially when there is a dispute between a broker and his client, parties do submit to arbitration in such disputes, but it is again only a documentation only arbitration. There even lawyers are not permitted, and if a party wants to have representation of lawyers, a special request has to be made setting out reasons as to why you want to have the lawyer present. So these are certain steps and means whereby parties can try and reduce certain costs when going to an arbitration, especially when the arbitration claims are not large claims, but substantially smaller claims in the range of 50 lakhs, 30 lakhs, 45 lakhs, 50 lakhs, 60 lakhs, small claims. So we can try to work the entire arbitration proceeding, trying to minimize the cost involved in the arbitration proceedings.
Thank you, sir. Very well explained indeed. Moving forward, it has been observed that the managing director or chairman of the lender sometimes emphasize to provide or stipulate in their loan agreement that in the event of any default or dispute, the arbitrator will be appointed by the lenders only. Now consider a scenario where if the lender is fair and appoints an independent ex-judge, then can the validity of this clause be challenged under the amended Arbitration Act? Also, if you could supplement your viewpoint with any leading judgments in this connection. Thank you.
That's a good question, Rishabh. But recently, in fact, as recent as November 2019, the Supreme Court again looked at the issue in the matter of Perkins Eastman's Architect DPC and another versus HSCC India Limited. In this case, what was the dispute resolution clause? In fact, the dispute resolution clause provided that, in fact, it provided an ADR mechanism and it provided for an arbitration. So the dispute resolution clause provided that if there is a dispute, that the consultant shall within 15 days request the general manager for his decision on the dispute. The general manager will have to give his decision within 1 month from the date of receipt of such request. If he does not do so within the period of 1 month, then the consultant has a right to appeal to the engineer, a director engineer. The director engineer will have to give his decision within 30 days. And if dissatisfied, then the consultant would have to give a notice to the chairman and managing director of the HSCC in this case, and the chairman and managing director then would have to appoint an arbitrator within 30 days from date of receipt of the notice. So two facts to be which were in play before the Supreme Court. One fact was that the chairman managing director had to appoint the arbitrator within 30 days of receipt of the notice. The contention raised were twofold. One, the notice invoking arbitration was given, but the appointment was done on the 31st day. And the reason the appointment was done on the 31st day was that they argued that on the 30th day being a holiday, the appointment was done on the very next day. And the second contention raised was that the chairman and managing director could not have appointed the arbitrator to resolve this dispute. Now, considering a gamut of judgments, the Supreme Court finally held that though the clause empowers the chairman and managing director of the respondent to make the appointment of the sole arbitrator, the said clause also stipulates that no person other than the person appointed by such chairman and managing director of the respondent would act as an arbitrator. So, pursuant to the amendment which has come in the 2015 Act, it clearly provides that no person having an interest in the arbitration can then appoint a person. So, this argument was upheld in earlier decisions passed by the Supreme Court, especially in the decision of Walter Bow and TRF Limited versus NRGO. So, using these two decisions, what the Supreme Court said, that if a person who himself was disqualified and disentitled could also not nominate any other person to act as an arbitrator. So they use the Latin maxim per facet per se. So what does this maxim mean? It means that one person who is disqualified, or you can't get things done through one way, you cannot do it, you cannot get things done through the other way. That means in this case, the chairman and managing director himself was disqualified. So he himself being disqualified, he could not have appointed an arbitrator, though the arbitrator appointed was a neutral arbitrator in this case. The Supreme Court goes and holds that the arbitrator appointed is a neutral arbitrator. He had nothing to do with the matter, but merely because the clause 24 of the respective dispute resolution clause which the parties entered into provided for the chairman and managing director make the appointment. The Supreme Court held that such an appointment cannot be made. So trust this clarifies the issue, and this judgment now is set in stone and will have to be prevailed.
Thank you, sir. Moving further, could you also explain to us where an agreement between an Indian party and a foreign party provides for a foreign law and dispute resolution by courts in India? Now, in such scenario, what are the difficulties that you see in enforcement of such agreements before the Indian courts? Thank you.
That's a good question. And in this regard, what I would like to say is that an Indian court will take judicial notice only of laws in force in India. Foreign law must be proved like any other fact. Now, this is a provision in the Indian Evidence Act. Therefore, if the agreement provides for foreign law, then the foreign law should be pleaded like any other fact. And once you plead a particular aspect as a matter of fact, then the corollary is that you have to lead evidence on the matter of fact that is pleaded. And this being foreign law, you require to have a foreign expert to lead evidence to substantiate as to what exactly is the foreign law. So this requirement to prove foreign law under the rules of evidence has been upheld by the Indian Supreme Court in the case of Harishankar Jain versus Sonia Gandhi. It's a 2001 Supreme Court judgment where the Supreme Court held that it would be able to interpret the agreement's choice of law provisions only if the parties adduce evidence thereof. And in this case, the choice of law was English law.
Thank you, sir. Now, moving on to my next query. Many a times we often see that there are parties to the agreement, for example, based out of Mumbai. The transaction has been took place in Mumbai itself. However, the agreement provides for seat of arbitration in Delhi and gives the exclusive jurisdiction to the courts of Delhi. So in such cases, shall the exclusive jurisdiction of Delhi court stand valid in your view? Over to you.
Thank you for the question. Now, In this case, when you have the transaction and the parties based in Mumbai, the principle and the law applied is that parties cannot confer jurisdiction to a particular court, more so if the court does not have jurisdiction, and generally jurisdiction of a court is linked to where the cause of action has arisen. So a cause of in the instant case, the cause of action at best has arisen in Mumbai because the agreement is based in Mumbai, the transaction happened in Mumbai, the parties also reside in Mumbai, and nothing as such has happened in Delhi. Therefore, in this case, the courts in Mumbai will have jurisdiction. Further, if, for example, there are more than one courts which have jurisdiction, then in such circumstances, parties by contract can exclude one of the courts, or you can say parties by contract can confer exclusive jurisdiction to one of the courts if there are multiple courts which do have jurisdiction. This principle has been laid down way back in 1989 in the case of ABC Laminate Private Limited and another versus AP Agencies Salem. Hope this answers the question.
Thank you, sir. Now we would like you to enlighten us with the difficulty faced by the parties in carrying out the conciliation proceedings before initiating arbitration. As we know, many a times the arbitration clauses in the pertinent agreement do provide for pre-conciliation. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Mostly conciliation primarily is looked as something which a party has to just get done and over with, and most of the times what we have seen, and based on my experience in conciliation proceedings, is that there is a right to walk away by a party. So most of the time the party doesn't even participate in the conciliation, thereby frustrating the conciliation proceedings from the very inception. It not being mandatory by law, parties just choose not to participate in the conciliation proceedings. Maybe one of the reasons is that parties are under a misnomer that there has to be a single conciliator to be appointed. So this misnomer has to be thrown out, because the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, especially the provisions dealing with the conciliation, provides that for a conciliation proceedings, both parties can have a single conciliator. So in effect, there can be two conciliators sitting and deciding on a conciliation proceedings. So we have to take advantage of such a fact whereby we have two conciliators to sit and decide. One can be your nominee, one can be the other party's nominee, and they can decide on the issues. What falls out is that in case there is some finality, then a settlement agreement is drawn upon, and that settlement agreement becomes binding. Why do most parties deter from going to a conciliation is maybe because there is always the trust apprehension or the apprehension of confidentiality. In conciliation, what happens is generally the conciliator has a one-to-one dialogue with a party. Now, always parties have a tendency to think that if I am not known to the conciliator, then what happens to the one-to-one dialogue? There may be something brewing between the conciliator and the other party, and therefore they do not participate. But these apprehensions can be put forth or can be put to rest if you have a proper detailed filing or proceeding being made and a case being presented on your side. So parties, my view is parties should use conciliation proceedings. Why? Because it not only narrows down the issues which go to the arbitration, and thereby ensuring that there is a quicker arbitration proceedings which will follow, and therefore conciliation should be given a try. It is confidential and highly confidential between the parties. Documents cannot be disclosed, nor can the conciliator be called as a witness in proceedings, whether civil or, if in this case the arbitration, cannot be called as a witness in the arbitration proceedings. So hence, conciliation proceedings should be given a try, and hopefully it should attain what is said to be attained to ensure a speedy disposal of a case. Hope this answers the question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fernandes, for your valuable insights. Now let us move on to our next panelist for today, that is Mr. Mahim Sharma. Hello, Mahim. Could you hear me?
Hi, Rishabh. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are. So, Mahim, my first question to you is, Could you please take us through what is the procedure for initiating a
Hello.
in your experience so far? How long does it generally or approximately take for a hello? Am I audible to you? Could you confirm?
Right. You're audible. You're audible, Rishabh.
Hello.
You're
Yeah,
audible.
so I'll carry on with the question. Yeah. So my first question to you is, could you please take us through what is the procedure for initiating a check bounce case? And also in your experience so far in the Mumbai courts, how long does it generally or approximately take for a check bounce case to get disposed of before the courts in Mumbai more particularly? Over to you, Mike.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. So, with regards to Rishabh's question, I'll be dealing with mostly negotiable instruments and more particularly check bounce issue that mostly all the corporates face day in and day out. And for the purpose of this topic, I'd like to just demarcate a few things clearly. That is, when I use the term drawer, it means the person who has drawn the check. When I say payee, the person who is receiving the check or who is the holder in due course, as defined under the Negotiable Instruments Act, is what I'm referring to when I say payee. And the drawee is the bank upon whom the check has been drawn. So to understand the ambit of the check bounce cases, especially in Mumbai, first we'll have to understand what exactly comprises of a check bounce and what are the important elements and how are companies made a party to such proceedings. To start that, we have to understand the sections between 138 to 142 of the Negotiable Instruments Act. The essentials of this crime, and it is a penal provision, mind you, because it entails 2 years of imprisonment and twice the amount of check as compensation. So it is definitely a penal provision, but in the nature of a summary trial. The trial is supposed to be disposed of as quickly as possible in a summary manner. 138, the liability provision essentially states that when a check is drawn on an account of the drawer for the payment of a debt or liability, the payment of money is for the discharge of a debt or liability. And mind you, this term is important and we'll be coming across this term a lot, especially if you're dealing with negotiable instruments. That is discharge of debt and liability, and the check is dishonored. Now, dishonored, although in 138, the provision, it has been defined only as when the balance is insufficient or when the arrangement with the bank account is such that the check is dishonored. But judicial proceedings have extended it to other cases also, such as stop payments. Voluntary stop payments will also entail a liability under 138. So moving on, 139 of the Negotiable Instruments Act is actually a unique provision because it changes the liability in the sense that there is a reverse burden. If the accused of a check bounce case, it is, if there's an accused and he has given a check, it is assumed that the check has been given for discharging some or the other debt or liability. And the fulcrum of the whole case technically revolves around the fact that whether the check was given for a discharge of liability or not. The whole trial revolves around this process in which the complainant tries to prove that the check was valid and given for a debt or liability, whereas the accused wants to prove that it was not for any debt or liability and there is no case of a check bounce is made out. Companies in this particular scenario are roped in by virtue of a express provision, as in criminal law there is no vicarious liability unless there is an express provision to that effect. Section 141 clarifies and incorporates the concept of vicarious liability into this act, wherein companies, and the principle here is in charge of day-to-day affairs of the company, or essentially being at the helm of the affairs of the company. People who at the time of commission of offense were at the helm of affairs, they were responsible for the company, they were responsible for the management of the company. That is, your designation is not important, your role is what will make you attributable to the crime, is what's important, and therefore those people will be made as parties and will be made as accused in the proceedings. 142 is a very important provision because it has been recently amended in 2015 and 142A has been inserted. There was a lot of catastrophe in terms of jurisdiction, I would say, of check bounce cases till these provisions were inserted and basically the clouded area was cleared. Now the jurisdiction is such that if I draw a check and give it to some person X, then the place where X deposits the check, where he is having a bank account, say I'm in Mumbai and X has a bank account in Delhi, the place where he deposits the check, that court of that territorial jurisdiction, the courts of Delhi, will have jurisdiction. Now, this seems to be very favoring a lot to the payee, very payee biased law, it seems. But that's not the case, because through 142A, an amendment was made which says that if I have given one check to X, or if I have given 10 checks to X, and if proceedings are pending before 15 June 2015, all the previous proceedings and all the future proceedings, if any, of Negotiable Instruments Act will be heard in the same court. So X cannot take my check and deposit it in Calcutta, even if he has a branch there, because he has already deposited one check in Delhi. The case is going on in Delhi, and all other future cases will go on there. So this helps to maintain some sort of uniformity and not create a chaos which was happening before in terms of jurisdiction. Now, moving on to the procedure is rather simple, and as I said, it's a summary trial. So essentially, when the check bounces and when you receive the return memo, the complainant has 30 days to send a statutorily mandated legal notice. Now, mind you, if this statutorily mandated legal notice is not sent, the complaint is not maintainable. A statutory notice has to be sent. The statutory notice has to have a 15-day time period, granting 15 days time to the accused to pay back the money of the check that is bounced. If the payment is not received within 15 days, post the 15 days, there's a 30-day period to file the complaint. Once the complaint is filed, the judicial magistrate is technically supposed to summon the complainant and examine the complaint. Although from a pragmatic view, this does not happen, and it is taken as, on the face of it, it is just taken as is. If the return memo is present, if the checks are present, if the statutory notice along with the postal receipts are annexed, the complaint is admitted. One crucial point in this summary process is the deposit of 20% of the check amount. Once the summons are issued, the accused are present, bail is granted, and the stage of plea comes in, where the accused states whether they are guilty or not guilty. If the accused states that they are not guilty, the trial commences, it moves on to the appreciation of evidence stage. But there's a very interesting point here, that 20% of the check amount has to be deposited by the accused with the court pending the proceeding. So if any dispute has to be settled at this point, it will be settled, and is more likely to be settled rather, and because nobody wants to part with 20% of whatever the check amount is, as it affects liquidity. So this is a major turning point for most disputes, and if they have to settle, they settle right here. Another important point of the procedure is that the difference between bailable and non-bailable. A lot of people assume that check bounce cases may entail jail time. Initially, that is not the case, not until you're convicted. It is only in case of bailable offenses, bail is by default. There is no arrest, there's no possibility of any arrest whatsoever. All offenses, be it NI Act, be it IPC. So in this case, bail is by default, unless there is something that is missed by the accused, or some compliance, or if suppose they're supposed to remain present before the court and they're not. Once, twice, an exemption application can be filed. The accused's personal appearance may be exempted. But the third time, say the court does not find cogent reasons to, exempt the accused from its personal appearance, then in that case, they may issue a warrant. And in the first case, it will be a bailable warrant, which again does not entail an arrest. Only when there is a major default, an NBW or a non-bailable warrant is issued, and in that case, the police may arrest you. Although it does entail 24 hours in jail time, but bail is typically easy to get. But once you deposit something of a bond, or say they may ask for a personal guarantee, or they may ask cash to be deposited. So all in all, this is the main procedure of 138 before moving on to the evidence appreciation. Once evidence appreciation begins, it is like a normal trial. People are cross-examined, chief examined, all the witnesses, and finally a judgment is passed. I hope this clears the air, and over to you, Rishabh.
Thank you, Mahim. Very well explained indeed. Moving forward, my next question to you is, quite often, we see that the independent directors or the other directors who are not even directly involved in the day-to-day operations of the company, they are also pleaded as accused. in cases of Section 138 of Negotiable Instruments Act or similar other criminal proceedings involving or pertaining to commercial laws. So, of course, such directors would not want to waste their precious time and money by being involved in these petty criminal proceedings. So, in light of these situations, could you please take us through what is the records available to such directors to get discharged and how quickly can they actually get discharged? Over to you, Mani.
Thank you, Rishabh. So what I would say is the issue of independent non-executive directors is a very common one. We face it all the time, even though the law is more than settled now in that regard. But somehow, as I said before, the cognizance stage wherein the magistrate views the complaint, checks the averments, and issues process or summons to the accused or the potential accused is mechanical. It's cursory to say the least, that the magistrate in practicality does not really examine as to what is the role of the directors and especially the non-independent, non-executive independent directors. And what happens more often than not is that the complainant say I have to file a complaint and I just go to the MCA website, take out the names of all the directors on the roster and make them parties. I can find their addresses there. I find all the details. I can send them legal notices, and that's how most executive independent non-executive directors are made parties. So the recourse in such cases is, as I said before, the term helm of the affairs or in charge of the day-to-day affairs of the company is very important. This is a settled principle. The court in 20, as early as 2014, settled it in 2005 rather, settled it in SMS Pharmaceuticals, which was a very important case because in this case, it was clearly held that an averment, that how the party is in charge of the affairs is important. If there is no averment against, say, there is an averment against X, Y, both the directors, but there is no averment against Z, still Z has been made a party in the cause title of the complaint, there can be no process against him. There can be no summons. Now, in 2005, this judgment made this clear that an averment is necessary. But then in practice, the averment was cursory. The averment was just put in, same lines were cut, copy, pasted, repeated, and different parties were made, different executive directors were made parties. Now, moving on, subsequent case laws came into picture which cleared the air further. One of it was Anita Malhotra judgment in 2012, which was basically a non-executive independent director who had resigned 6 years ago. And because, and this is again a fairly common thing, that the MCA may not have removed her name from the roster and she was still being shown as a non-executive independent director. The court was pleased to quash this aside, the complaint, the process aside, only to her extent, and she was no longer made a party in the complaint. So this is also the first recourse that a person has is a revision, criminal revision against the process, the issuance of summons in the sessions court. If there is grave injustice and downright on the face of it, prima facie, there is nothing made out, it is amply clear that the person is not liable, then they can consider moving for a quashing petition, which is a section 482 of the Criminal Procedure Code petition, before the High Court. And the High Court has the power to quash and set aside the process. So these are the two remedies available. Now, one very important judgment has been passed in March 2020, which is Sunita Palta versus Kit Marketing Limited. Now, this is a Delhi High Court judgment, but what I feel is that it basically covers most Supreme Court judgments, and the reasoning is rather sound. It's an intelligible judgment, and it should hold good even when it goes to the Supreme Court. So now this judgment has cleared the air completely, and it holds that non-executive directors are mere custodians. They are not involved in the day-to-day affairs of the company. They are not in charge of the business. They only monitor the business activities. And what all these terms that I'm using right now are used in the judgment, and used in the judgment, they have been relied upon from previous judgments, all the way from SMS Pharmaceuticals to judgments as new as those in 2018. So it's a sound reasoning, and the court has gone to the extent of holding that non-executive independent directors are immune. If no role can be attributable to them. Nothing is on the record to show that they had anything to do with the check. They are immune and they cannot be held liable. And a quashing petition is a good recourse in such cases because the High Court is normally quicker in its functioning and taking their decisions. And quashing petition will entail a favorable outcome in such cases. So I think that clarifies the question, Rishabh. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mahi. Now I'll come to my next question. Quite often we come across a lot of cases in which security checks have been issued and the drawer often objects to its encashment or any liability arising out of a dishonor in case of a security check. So we would like you to actually clear the air in the aspect of these security checks and section 138 thereof. Over to you, Mahi.
Right. Right, Rishabh, thank you. This is another thing that is prevalent everywhere, which is the confusion regarding security checks and how they're construed. Are they like there have been judgments as early as 2012 with the Gujarat High Court, which have said that blank checks are blank leaves, they cannot be used. And there are judgments post that have cleared the air and made it a rather simple principle that if there is a subsisting debt or liability, the key terms here are subsisting debt or liability, and then there are security checks that have been given. They may be blank checks. Let's not refer to them as security checks. Let's just call them blank checks. Blank checks can be used as a regular instrument, a regular negotiable instrument, and if the check subsequently bounce, it may be because of payment being stopped, or it may be because of the funds being insufficient. But such a check is a valid check. Such a check bounce is liable to be prosecuted under Section 138 of the Negotiable Instruments Act. And this has been cleared by a dichotomy of, I would say, two very important judgments. One is Indus Airways of 2014 and one is Sampali Satyanarayan Rao of 2016. Now, Indus Airways is a peculiar one and it has been distinguished, not set aside or overruled, but merely distinguished in Sampali Satyanarayan Rao. Indus Airways, what had happened was an advance payment was required to be made. Consequently, the advance payment was made via a blank check. Later on, the drawer of the check made a stop payment because the transaction was not about to go through. The business transaction, the crux of issuing the payment instrument on paying the money did not happen at all, and entailing which that the parties malevolently they encashed the check bounced, they filed a complaint, a quashing petition was moved, and subsequently the Supreme Court held that as it was an advance payment, there was no subsisting debt or liability. It could not have been a valid check, and the instrument did not, it did not entail a liability under 138 of the Negotiable Instruments Act. Moving on to 2016, Sampali Satyanarayan Rao clarified further while discussing Indus Airways. This was a peculiar arrangement. This is what we most often face, which is a loan agreement. And in this particular loan agreement, the security check was defined as security under the definition of security. And a number of security checks were given. They were encashed. Payment was stopped. Checks bounced. Complaints went ahead, and the complainant the accused went for quashing petition. The Supreme Court clearly enunciated the subsisting debt or liability provision and distinguished from Indus Airways on the ground of Indus Airways being on the grounds of advance payment, whereas Sampali Satyanarayan Rao clarified that if there is a subsisting debt or liability, the checks are valid and they will entail a liability under 138. This has been further clarified by Bir Singh, which was passed in 2019. The Bir Singh judgment also said that blank checks can be encashed clearly on the point of blank checks, not even security checks. That blank checks can be used. They will entail 138 as long as there's something subsisting on the books of accounts. Now, subsisting on the books of accounts is again a debatable question. And mind you, if a person is not able to go for a quashing or a revision, does not mean that they cannot prove themselves not guilty at trial. The whole concept of a 138 trial is to find out whether there was a subsisting debt or liability, whether the payment was made for that purpose only, and the accused still has one more chance to establish his ground. And security checks, as I would say, security checks and blank checks, the air is rather clear. And to advise, especially because we have faced this issue with certain clients before, and a few clients have been cautious. They have defined the term security. You may define the usage of such blank checks in your contracts, or in case of an individual that we had faced once, the individual just took a copy of the check and made the receiver sign it as to what purpose and on what date this check is being taken for, so that these checks do not be misused in any way. So I think that clarifies, Rishabh.
Thank you, Martin. I'll proceed to my last question for you. We often see that parties are taking recourse to or invoking the provisions of the Indian Penal Code or resorting to the criminal complaints, using them as a mechanism for recovery over and above the civil and 138 proceedings. So, we would like you to opine, in your considered opinion, to what extent this is correct and what can the complainant or accused do in such cases. Over to you, Mike.
Right. So this is a very, very common predicament that people from both sides face, and I would say the accused and the complainant both face this issue of what to do in case of them being actually cheated, and what to do in case they have not committed any crime, and nonetheless, along with a civil suit, along with a check bounce case, they are being roped in into criminal proceedings as well. These may be used as pressure tactics, but what I would suggest is that the law is rather clear now, because a catena of Supreme Court judgments have come which clarify that civil proceedings cannot be given a criminal color when there are, it is no bar, although, that if there is a 138 proceeding going on, if there is a civil suit going on, that does not directly entail that there is no liability, there's no criminal liability. It does not tantamount to that at all. So from the complainant side, I would say that if there is a legitimate cause for believing, because the concept of criminal breach of trust and cheating has a rather higher, I would say the standard or the barometer is rather high as to who is liable for it. So from the complainant side, I would say that such complaints should be initiated only when it is abundantly clear that the essentials are fulfilled. The essentials in the brief are that, especially with the case of criminal breach of trust, which is the most common one, 406 of the IPC that we see, is that there has to be an entrustment in the first place. Now, giving a check does not mean entrustment. Giving them goods as a part of a business transaction and not receiving payment for that does not normally entail entrustment, because that was a business transaction. Unless and that entrustment has been clearly violated and there was a malified intention to that effect, and or there's a dominion over some property which was leased out, or that property was maybe given as an ancillary thing along with the goods supplied or along with the services supplied, and that dominion has been misappropriated. Only in such high standards of cases can cheating and criminal breach of trust be incorporated and can be you can invoke these provisions. And from a complainant's perspective, the standard is rather high, and so only when you're sure, you should incorporate these proceedings and consider a complaint. From an accused perspective, as I said before, the law is rather settled. Criminal proceedings cannot be invoked just like that without a standard, and civil proceedings cannot be given a criminal color. Quashing is the first option, although courts are rather reluctant to use their powers of quashing because they are inherent powers. It's a settled principle that they're supposed to be used sparingly and in the rarest of the rare cases. So first step, what is suggested and what is the legal recourse is filing a revision in the sessions court. Once this revision is rejected, then a quashing petition can be filed in the high court to quash these proceedings and set them aside. And the two most important things here are the FIR and your charge sheet. Ideally, if no case is made out under 406 or 420, the charge sheet should involve a C summary, which essentially states that a civil case is made out and a criminal case is not made out. So a C summary report is filed and the case is supposed to end right there. But as we know, the investigation authorities of our country, they may choose, and as they have the discretion, they may choose to incorporate these provisions and file a charge sheet. Still, at the stage of taking cognizance, there is one more stage before revision, which is filing a discharge application. You can file an application for discharge. If the discharge is rejected, we can go for the revision. If the revision is rejected, we can go to the High Court, and obviously we have the Supreme Court after. So there are ample case laws in support of the accused, wrongly made and accused, that is. And I would say that the principles are rather settled, although we will not stop seeing such frivolous complaints. But the person who is being roped into such frivolous complaints is, I would say, rather secure, and the legal recourse is set in stone now, and the principles are in their support as of now. So I think that clarifies. Over to you, Rishabh.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mahim. Let us now come back to Ms. Sandhya here for another round of pertinent questions pertaining to the modes of recovery. Am I audible to you?
Yes, I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, ma'am. Yeah. So I'll carry on with the question.
Yeah.
So, ma'am, the question is, we would like to have your view on whether there is a requirement for a complete rethink on the very functioning of the DRTs as an effective means of recovery, especially in today's times. Further, if you could also suggest any of the measures which should be adopted so as to ensure that DRT becomes an effective tribunal. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, so see, this DRT was set up around the year 1999. And in the first 1 year, DRT was generally, it was having its teething problems. There was only one bench and there would be long adjournments. There were very few cases as well. And then what happened was there were 3 benches set up in the year 2000, around the year 2000. And things were moving very efficiently for about some time. In fact, matters could not be decided in 6 months as was required under the Act. But you know, I have had experience of ex parte matters being decided in DRT within 11 months. And I've had even a complex contested matter with multiple banks, which was decided those days in 3 years. But however, unfortunately, over the last 10-15 years, DRT has become very, very ineffective on account of various reasons. So just to enumerate some of the reasons, one is adjournments are granted very easily. There are lots of frivolous applications filed by the borrowers which are entertained. Then even banks, there are faults on the part of the banks because they do not produce their complete documents and statement of account. Then the staff in DRT is not adequate. And generally, there is a lack of will in order to dispose of matters quickly. One more reason that, you know, this RDB Act has not been very successful is that by the time the banks get the recovery certificate and are able to reach the borrower or the guarantors, borrower and guarantor is always one step ahead and they are able to alienate most of their assets. And after struggling for so many years in DRT, banks virtually get nothing. So this has been a reason why even banks have been very disillusioned with RDB Act. Another problem with this one, DRT, is the size of the pleadings. They are so lengthy. We need to cut down the size. Somebody has lent money, somebody has borrowed money. The only question is, have you repaid or have you not? Why do you have to have such bulky pleadings? Even arguments, time limit given to people. Why do you need to have part third matters? All that you have to examine is has the person prepaid or not. So here also the length of amount of time given for arguments to different advocates has to be cut down. Interestingly, in the year 2016, there was an amendment which provided that DRT applications should be dealt with as expeditiously as possible and every effort shall be made to complete the proceeding in 2 hearings and dispose of the application in 180 days. Now, we will laugh when we say 2 hearings because we know that we ourselves have a matter which is pending in DRT for around 11-12 years now. But if you ask me, is it possible to dispose of in 2 hearings? My answer is yes, it is possible. It's just that the will is needed. Now, in DRTs and most tribunals in India, if you see, they are not the judges and the tribunal members, and very few judges are computer savvy. So you have to train them to use the computers. That is lacking. Like, for example, suppose the DRT presiding officer has a computer before him and he is now, you have set up information utilities for the purpose of IBC. Let DRT use that information utility information. So when the DRT presiding officer is hearing a matter, he has a computer before him. He can access the information utility and find out whether there is a record of default. He can also see the sub-registrar's records and see if there is a valid mortgage. He can see the ROC website and see whether there is a charge. He can see your CERSAI documents, whether your security has been created. And with all this, when there is proof that there is a default, when there is proof that there is a security created, why do you require time? He can immediately pass an order. Why one? It can be two. You can do it in one hearing. So, I think you have to use all these systems that you have set up in order to enable DRT to take up. And I think amendment of the act is required to enable him. Now that the IBC is suspended, maybe banks have no option but to go to DRT and SARFAESI. So I think you need to sort of strengthen or give teeth to these two acts. Now, I would like to add one thing to what Naina said on information utility. Now, see, this is something that is introduced recently, that if you have already filed an application in NCLT, go get a record of default from the information utility. So now today I will go to the information utility and tell them that, oh, 3 years back I disbursed a loan, I created security. Today the borrower has defaulted. So you please give notice and take his response whether it is default or not. In all likelihood, that borrower will dispute it. So in the beginning, all the cases that you get will be disputed, and you will get very few cases which are authenticated or deemed to be authenticated. But no, one shouldn't be disillusioned, because the IU is a good facility that we are trying to set up. And I think what I expect over the years from IU, you may not see the results today, but you will see it in 3-4 years, is, see, suppose today I am a lender disbursing a loan. I go and file all the information with IU saying that this is the amount that is disbursed, these are the securities that I have, these are the repayment dates. Today, before disbursing, I go and tell the borrower that, look here, these are all the details, please confirm it. He will confirm it. 2 years down the line, when he defaults, he should not be allowed to dispute unless there is a due date and there is a default amount. The only way he should be allowed to dispute the default is by proving that he has paid the money. Otherwise, he should not be allowed. So if he is saying there is a dispute, prove that you paid the money. Otherwise, IU should record it as a default. So you do this, then the system is going to function. And I hope the IUs follow a system or something like this or something similar, so that the borrower does not have the opportunity of frivolously disputing the debt. Yeah, that I concluded.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. On a continuing note to what you have just explained about the current state of affairs in DRT, we would like you to throw some further lights and share your views. Since the onset of the IBC, we have witnessed a significant decline in the number of SARFAESI actions being initiated by the banks and financial institutions, especially in the recent times. So in light of this, could you please take us through what are the common challenges faced in enforcing the SARFAESI actions? Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, so as I was mentioning earlier, IBC is not a recovery mechanism. And with the overload of cases in NCLTs today, we have already seen the pending backlog. Orders do not get passed for a long time after it is reserved for orders. There is delay in orders being uploaded after they are passed, not to speak about the adjournments that we see. So I'm not too sure how long IBC will find favor with the lenders. As it is, one finds bankers already getting quite disillusioned with IBC. So IBC will find favor with banks where the units or that corporate debtor has value, and there is a possibility, a reasonable possibility of a resolution at a good price. But if the unit is not operating properly, company does not have cash flows, banks may not prefer IBC. This is because the CIRP costs and the liquidation costs may eat up into the bank's security. So there may be also cases where security value is not adequate to cover even CIRP and liquidation costs. And here, of course, the amendments to the CIRP and liquidation regulations also require that the bankers have, or the financial creditors have to contribute to liquidation costs. So if you look at it from the banker's perspective, taking very bad cases to IBC would amount to throwing good money after bad money. And they may choose to take only those banks to IBC where there is a good probability of resolution. So having said that, now I think a comparison between IBC and SARFAESI is not at all fair. And the reason is, look at the powers which an IRP or a RP has. They are much more than the powers which the lender has in SARFAESI. In IBC, one spends so much money on professional advisors. But if you look at this one, SARFAESI banks, the same banks are so stingy when it comes to spending money on enforcing under SARFAESI. So banks should consider spending money on good advisors who help them to repossess assets and locate prospective buyers. And the fee paid can be based on success. Then secondly, SARFAESI has also, the important thing about SARFAESI is SARFAESI does give very wide powers to the banks and can be used as an effective tool. The main problems that are faced in SARFAESI are sometimes, the decision to enforce under SARFAESI is taken quite late. And by that time, the promoters have taken away valuable assets from the unit. Now, I don't like this, under 13.4, you give that 13.2, you give that 60-day notice. It's like a warning. A dishonest borrower will take away all the assets in those 60 days. So I would like to see that 60-day period come down. Sometimes when you're going to repossess and sell your assets under SARFAESI, there is resistance from the labor, sometimes from the unions, and sometimes even from political groups. And the most important difficulty faced under a SARFAESI is that the dues are very high and the bankers are unable to find buyers to at a price which is acceptable to them and where they are able to recover a reasonable amount of due. So this is one of the major problems faced under SARFAESI. But incidentally, under SARFAESI, see the powers that they have. The banks can take possession of the secured assets and they have the right to transfer all these secured assets by lease, assignment, sale. They can take over the management of the business of the borrower and they can appoint any person to manage the secured assets of which the possession has been taken. So how do you give SARFAESI teeth, especially now that the IBC has been suspended? I think banks again need to take this up strong because we have been asking for stronger, more teeth to the RDB and SARFAESI, but it's not been happening, and it's only up to the bankers to maybe convince the government to change it. So I think even if you amend SARFAESI and provide that I as a lender, I have started my action under 13.4, and what I do is I want to change the management. So I give a notice to the borrower that I'm bringing in an alternate management. Then just like in IBC, the directors are suspended. In this case, SARFAESI also, once you give such a notice of change of management, the directors will automatically be deemed to have resigned and the lender can appoint the nominees of the new management. There should be a law that all employees of the borrower must cooperate with the lender and ensure smooth change of management. Otherwise, there are penal consequences for the employees. So this is something similar to what is there in IBC. Then if the net worth of the borrower has been eroded, you should also provide that new management should be given powers to cancel the existing capital and issue fresh shares. So that apart from change of management, there is change of ownership also. So if you give SARFAESI teeth, I think it can be give both DRT and SARFAESI teeth, more teeth. Then what happens is banks, the banks and financial institutions will have three very, very effective tools. You have the DRT, SARFAESI and IBC, and they can choose depending on the facts and circumstances of the case, they can choose which one to proceed. So with that, I conclude on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandhya ma'am, for your valuable insights. I shall now proceed to the closing remarks for today's session. So in conclusion from the today's session, we have seen that in the event of defaults in payment, there exists remedies available both under civil as well as in criminal laws. However, what exact strategy or remedy that a lender should adopt will purely depend upon the prevalent factual circumstances and factors such as, for instance, where the lender and the borrower are located, the nature of security held by the lender, whether the transaction documents are duly stamped and registered, and so on. However, it is very essential to realize one thing and caution about one thing in this regard, as it is quite famously said, one cap does not fit it all, hereby implying that what works for one lender may not work for another. Therefore, instead of blindfoldedly following as to what is the most common recourse being taken in the current times by other lenders as per the recent market trends, it is always more advisable to think and deliberate upon what strategy for recovery is best suited for your case and accordingly take a more informed decision. So with these parting remarks, we would like to wrap up for the session for today. On behalf of entire Rash Associates Advocates, I extend most sincere thanks to all the attendees for taking out their precious time to participate in today's webinar. I would also like to thank all our panelists for sharing their valuable insight on today's topics, which I believe shall be of immense importance in the days to come. Your valuable feedback for today's webinar are very invited. And of course, we could see that there was a large inflow of so many questions. But considering the time constraint, we could not answer them instantly. However, we shall get back to you promptly. And in case there are any further queries, we request you to feel free to mail us your queries pertaining to today's webinar, and we shall get back to you accordingly. So with these words, I hereby conclude today's session. I once again thank you all very much. Thank you.